He is truly the oracle of the Pennsylvania Leadership Conference. Where else can you hear the names Herodotus and Xerxes provided as the context for Pennsylvania in 21st century? John, thank you again. Now we're going to begin a conversation on the state of the conservative movement, particularly in Pennsylvania, but also nationally. We have, in addition to John, two wonderful panelists who will contribute mightily to this discussion. The first is Dr. Paul Kengor of Grove City College, who is also now the publisher of the general editor, of the American Spectator, and Jeff Lord, also of the American Spectator and Newsmax, formerly CNN, one of the most frequently televised commentators that is not just on our side of the political spectrum. So it's wonderful to have them both here with us. Please welcome them both. May I have the mic? Thank you. So we've got, 35 minutes in which to cover a broad scope analysis of where the conservative movement is. I'm going to suggest that we divide it into two parts. The first part will be the broad spectrum, the conservative movement, broadly speaking, nationally speaking, and specifically not with reference to the Trump indictment effect. So we want to talk about the cultural, the political movement, not just individual candidacies and this particular recent event. That doesn't mean we won't talk about the Trump effect. We're just not going to talk about the Trump indictment effect in the first half of our conversation. The second half of our conversation, we're going to address the Trump indictment effect within the context of politics, not the legal process. Anyone who's watched any television over the last couple of days have heard endless opinions from qualified and unqualified observers of the legal process who talk about whether it's legitimate to bootstrap a misdemeanor up to a felony and so on. We're going to stay away from that. We're going to talk about the purely political impact of the Trump indictment on the 2023 world and the 2024 presidential election. So with that as a framing, let me begin. And I think what we'll probably do, just to keep some sense of order, is we'll start with John. The first question will go to John. The next question will go to Jeff. The next one. And each of the ones that didn't start will have a chance to comment, but I'm going to start first with John, and then the next time, first with Jeff, and then first with Paul. So the first question has to do with an observation that a friend of the PLC for many years, isn't here this year, but has attended many years in the past, Grover Norquist, has always asserted that America is basically a center-right country. So my question to the three of you, starting with John, is that still correct? Is that an appropriate description of the American electorate in a broad sense philosophically?
Yes, it is, and I think the greatest proof of that is the man who is president right now. When you think that a Democratic Party that has been increasingly moving to the left passes over Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and so many others, whose AOC wing is just dripping with new support and contributors, and yet they pick the candidate who is most centrist and indeed took conservative positions on abortion and school busing at the genesis of his career 50 years ago. Now, how he governs is another matter. But I submit to you, Joe Biden ran and was elected as a centrist, not unlike Bill Clinton when he was elected, who completely abjured the term liberal. So I would say, for now at least, this country is definitely center-right. And one other thing, there will come a time, and I'm seeing this in Europe right now in various countries, where you will have a choice of someone who is not centrist but on the left and someone on the right for presidential candidates. And it will be fascinating to watch how they win the middle to come over. And I do think that this is a period of changing. The zeitgeist of politics is becoming less center-right, but for today, and right now, herein, it's a center-right country.
Jeff?
Well, I think, you know, the American political system and political parties...
We need some mic for you. We have mic for Jeff Lord?
He's got a mic.
I've got one here.
No, I know. It just didn't seem like it was picking you up.
Can you hear me?
Right.
Up there?
Good.
Yes.
Right.
Okay. I think one of the interesting things about the American political system and political party system is that we have what in the world of baseball is called the farm team. And the farm team at the moment for the Democratic Party consists of course, AOC and her friends. I find it interesting that Senator Schumer, who's not just the majority leader, but is the senator from New York, I think he keeps looking over his shoulder to see if he's going to get a challenge at some point in the Democratic primary in New York from AOC. The farm team finally saying, okay, we've had enough of being the farm team. We want to do the major leagues. So I think that that is always operative. It works the same way in the Republican Party. I mean, we've got people out there running for president right now who nobody necessarily thought of as running for president before. Or if they did, you know, they had other positions, governor of South Carolina. In Vivek's case, you know, he's a businessman and all this. That's our farm team. And there will be others. And they tend to get produced in every election cycle. I remember, not to date myself, but political geek that I was as a kid, following the 1966 elections. And when they were over, Newsweek magazine had the cover. They had the governor-elect of California, Ronald Reagan, the governor of New York, Nelson Rockefeller, senator from Illinois, Charles Percy, and I think there were a couple others there. But they had them all like in a circle. Romney, exactly. Governor George Romney, that would be. They had them all there in a circle, and they were exploring, you know, who stands a shot here at becoming president. And then, of course, they had Richard Nixon, who wasn't elected to anything in 1966, but played a real role in getting others elected. So we've been here before, and we'll be here again. Paul?
Yeah, so, you know, for the longest time, when Gallup and other organizations did polling on this question, they would ask Americans to identify if they're conservative, liberal, moderate. And the conservative figure was usually about 35 to 40%, and the liberal figure was about 20 to 25. And so conservatives were winning that for the longest time. And I used to use that data a lot when pointing out that 90% of journalists are liberals, right? 90% of college professors are liberals. And these are the people that preach diversity, right? And if they wanted to really embrace diversity, you know, they ought to at least have 50-50. I mean, you know, the country was always more conservative than it was liberal. I think those numbers are changing a little bit. I think the liberal number is up, maybe upper 20s. Conservative number is maybe upper 30s. But conservatives still have the edge on that. The upcoming generation, they're definitely more left. In fact, I'll give you some numbers. Another area that I study quite a bit, communism, socialism. There's a breakthrough. They asked the question, a number of different groups have asked this, do you prefer capitalism or socialism? And the breakthrough year was under Obama, 2010. And for the first time, people said, it was young people said they prefer socialism over capitalism by 44 to 42%. So that number changed there. And look at some of the rising stars on the left. I mean, AOC was described by the head of the DNC, Tom Perez, as the face and future of our party. And she comes out of not the Democratic Party, but the Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA. And the DSA calls itself the largest socialist organization in America. They have about 100,000 members, and they in their latest convention document, they refer to their members as comrades. Isn't that great?
Oh my.
So about 100,000 members, like 95,000, I think, to be almost exact. They have chapters on over 200 college campuses, and they are Cenk Uygur of the Young Turks, the Justice Democrats. He used to be with them. Said if we could get a few dozen AOCs and Ilhan Omars elected to Congress, quote, people will freak the hell out. and what they're doing is they are challenging traditional Democrats in Democratic safe districts. So AOC and Ilhan Omar and the others, they're not going to some conservative district where the Republican is going to win. They go to, in AOC's case, it was that district in New York,
Yes.
right, John, that had, I can't remember who the congressman was up there.
Joe Crowley.
Joe Crowley, that's right, who had been there maybe 20, 30 years, something like that, and challenged him, and then when she, yeah.
That was the Archie Bunker district.
Wow.
And
Wow.
as someone once said, Archie Bunker is buried in the Catholic Church's seminary there.
Wow. but that's who she challenged, and she won. And then in November against a Republican, she basically uncontested at that point. And that's the model that they've been following. They followed it here in Pennsylvania. In fact, in Pennsylvania, in my neck of the woods, well, I live in Grove City now, but I'm a native of Pittsburgh. Summer Lee is a DSA member, and she first got elected by challenging one of the Costas, right, and got elected to the state house here in Pennsylvania, and then tried the model again and got elected to Congress in November 2022 in the Squirrel Hill district. So she's now elected. Jamal Bowman, I think, is one, yeah, and James Chazar, I think, is the other from Texas. They now have about a dozen members in Congress, DSA members. They're the most radical among them. Who are the other? Who's the squad? AOC, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, right? The one at her swearing-in ceremony with her little boy next to her yelled, "We're going to impeach the mother," and said it right there on camera. Who are the other ones? Presley, and I forget who the other one.
Massachusetts. Oh,
Bowman?
Bush from Missouri.
Yes, that's right. That's right, Cori Bush. So this is a really radical group, and the idea is to get, as Cenk Uygur said, dozens of them elected to Congress and to literally take over the Democratic Party. So when John first started covering the White House for human events, I mean, the parties were much more, you had liberal and conservative Democrats. You had moderate Democrats. You had liberal Republicans. We had a couple liberal Republicans, right? Arlen Specter, John Hines. But the parties now are increasingly polarized. The Republicans are uniformly, by and large, more conservative, which I like. And the Democrats are just increasingly hardcore leftist ideologues across the board. And which means you're gonna see more and more and more party line votes, 218 to 216 or whatever it is on every single issue. So that's concerning. And for the conservative movement, I guess the opportunity there, Colin, is it gives you a chance to really define yourself. When you've got an adversary that's that clearly left, you can really distinguish yourself in what conservatism means. But, and we'll get to this, we need conservatives to better understand conservatism, which is why I like this panel and the quoting of history and different figures, because a lot of the upcoming generation, they don't know this stuff. They don't know a lot of the history. We need to go back and read some of the conservative founders.
One of the words of wisdom from Winston Churchill that I always liked, he said, if you're not a liberal when you're 20, you have no heart. If you're not a conservative by the time you're 40, you have no brain.
Right.
But the self-definition is very important. It has marketing value. Now, over the last 20 or 30 years, liberals have stopped identifying themselves as liberals. In fact, a better way to say it would be the left has stopped identifying itself as liberal. Now, we can all argue that it never was in the true sense of liberal, but nonetheless, it was a label. And conservatives and Republicans over the 25 or 30 years made it toxic. They referred to the L word. John pointed out a few moments ago that Bill Clinton ran as a centrist who was openly critical of being liberal. And the question that arises now is, has the term conservative in some minds in the political center become similarly, not as intensely, but in the same direction, similarly toxic? Has it lost any of its historic appeal that goes back to people like Stan Evans and William F. Buckley? Has it, and Barry Goldwater, who really for most of our generation sort of defined what conservatism was. Is the word conservative still the best label, or is there some rebranding that we need to consider? Or should we simply go back to the basics of conservatism and redefine it without apology for the name? So my question is one of branding. And let's begin with Jeff.
Yeah, I don't think we need to worry about that, frankly. You know, conservatism has really taken off. I went through my library and I brought these to show you. This belonged to my parents. This, it says at the top, they lived in Massachusetts at the time, Taft for President, 2nd Congressional District Committee. And it's a dear friend letter with all these names on the back, which include my mother and father. And it was about how to get Robert Taft nominated for president in 1952. And of course, he made a real try for it, lost to President Eisenhower.
The last best try.
Yes. And then, of course, this book came out after the 1960 election, The Conscience of a Conservative by Barry Goldwater. And one of the things that I remember, little geek that I was in 1960, staying with my grandmother for a couple weeks on the Eastern Long Island in the summertime, I, of course, wanted to watch the Republican and Democratic national conventions. And one of the things that I remember vividly is Richard Nixon, of course, then the incumbent vice president, was overwhelmingly nominated in 1960. But there was an attempt, it didn't go very far, to nominate Senator Barry Goldwater. And that earned, he got a few votes, and that earned him a place at the podium. And he came up sort of impromptu and gave this speech, and his memorable line was, "Let's grow up, conservatives." And over time, we did. And 4 years later, of course, he was the nominee. And yes, he went down to a decisive defeat by Lyndon Johnson. But as Paul certainly remembers, and John remembers, on October 27th of 1964, a movie actor named Ronald Reagan took to the nation's television screens and gave a speech known as A Time for Choosing. And 2 years later, over the objections of the California Republican establishment, they were supporting, believe it or not, San Francisco had a Republican mayor at that time, and he was a liberal, and he was their choice, and he got clobbered in the Republican primary. The Republican establishment was aghast at this. I remember reading in the run-up to the election, or before the election started, the New York Times ran a front-page story in 1965 that California Republicans, the establishment meaning, were just aghast at the thought that Ronald Reagan was going to run for governor of California and he'd lose in a landslide. Well, instead, he not only defeated the mayor in the Republican race, he won a 1 million vote landslide in the fall. And my favorite, Paul may remember this, my favorite commercial from that 1966 campaign had Governor Pat Brown, his Democratic opponent, looking into the camera and saying, Ronald Reagan is an actor. Pause, beat. And we know who shot Lincoln, right? That didn't help him very much, and down he went. But my point is that the conservative movement has really grown. And former Governor Reagan challenged for the nomination in 1976 with Gerald Ford, who was in the White House as Nixon's successor, came pretty close. I was there for that convention. It's the last time, I think I'm right, in American history that a presidential nomination actually came down to votes on the convention floor. And what happened, as I recall, it was the Mississippi delegation that at the last minute switched from Reagan to Ford, and that put Ford over the top. And memorably, when Ford came to accept the nomination, he looked up in the gallery, and there were the Reagans, and he said, "Come on down here." And Reagan, impromptu, developed a speech which was so powerful that one delegate was quoted as saying to the New York Times, "My goodness, we nominated the wrong guy." Well, 4 years later, and I remember being lectured by my political elders here in Pennsylvania that we had to support Ford because Reagan could never carry Pennsylvania. He not only carried Pennsylvania in 1980, he carried 44 states. And that was, I think, the conservative movement finally came into its own.
Paul, on college campuses, talk to us about how the terms liberal, progressive, and conservative resonate today.
Well, I think conservatism, the word is not in disrepute. I think it's okay. I agree that progressive is now more in vogue. I mean, there was a point in 1988 when Michael Dukakis, the New Republic, was begging him to call himself a liberal, right? But he couldn't. And George H.W. Bush's whole campaign was to frame Dukakis as a liberal, right? That was the goal.
Massachusetts.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
that's right.
Massachusetts
And then they started moving away from that label. I did a whole book on Hillary Clinton, and not until after the book did I notice she referred to herself as a progressive in a speech, and I thought, she never called herself a progressive before. What's up with this? But all of a sudden they started using that term. I actually think it's a better term because liberal really doesn't fit for where they are. And progressive, they view themselves as always progressing, changing, moving forward, right? Truth itself is changing. I mean, look at an issue, a cultural issue like marriage. 1994 and 95, the entire Democratic Party supported the Defense of Marriage Act, defining marriage between one man and one woman. Bill and Hillary both did. Barack Obama did. And now the entire party has, what's that?
He claimed to.
Right.
I never,
That's right.
I never believed Obama when he said
now
that.
the entire party has flipped 100%, and if you disagree with them and have the position they had 20 or 30 years ago, they call you a hater and try to cancel you. Right. So this is how they view progression. Now on Reagan and conservatism, I happen to have a definition from Reagan.
Happen to have had a book.
So this is February 6, 1977, Reagan's birthday, speaking at CPAC, and he's talking about a principled conservatism. And he said this: conservatism is the antithesis of the kind of ideological fanaticism that has brought so much horror and destruction to the world, which that's very much applies today, too. The common sense and common decency of ordinary men and women working out their own lives in their own way, that is the heart of American conservatism. Now, here's a good definition. Conservative wisdom and principles are derived from a willingness to learn, not just from what is going on now, but from what has happened before. Now, the modern progressive says, all that junk before, I mean, those people were backward, Judeo-Christian troglodytes, right? I mean, what did they know? Moral absolutes and, Reagan said, the principles of conservatism are sound because they're based on what men and women have discovered through experience in not just one generation or a dozen, but in all the combined experience of mankind. What G.K. Chesterton called that democracy of the dead. When we conservatives say that we know something about political affairs and that what we know can be stated as principles, we are saying that the principles we hold dear are those that have been found through experience to be ultimately beneficial for individuals, for families, for communities, for nations. I think of Justice Alito in the Obergefell hearings asking the person who supported same-sex marriage, he said, do you have any sociological data on what kids growing up in like a same-sex family, how they would develop? Well, that's a good question, Justice Alito. We really don't. And he said, this idea that you have isn't even as old as the cell phone. We don't know anything about where this is going to go. Well, I guess we really don't have any data, Justice Alito. Right, but the view is progress, forward, go. And then anybody who disagrees is a Neanderthal, an old conservative troglodyte. But that's what the progressives do. They push and they change and they reform and they go, 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 go. We are supposed to be anchored in these timeless absolutes based not just on one generation or a dozen, but all the combined experience of mankind. So I think we need to do some seminars, frankly, on reading some of these books and going back and teaching people what it truly means to be a conservative.
If conservatism is based upon truths, eternal, immutable
That's right.
truths, then we need to not change the branding, but return to the basic definition and embrace those truths as things that don't change over time.
That's right.
John, do you want to weigh in on this before we turn to Mr. Trump?
Yes. I think the very fact that anyone seeking the presidency on the Republican side or major offices in most states uses the self-characterization conservative. We are all conservatives now. And indeed, one can say, as I remarked earlier, that there are different categories of conservatives. Traditional conservative, a populist conservative, neoconservative, paleoconservative.
Reagan conservatives.
Reagan conservatives, yeah. But the term persists, and it will describe the Republican Party. Let me put it another way. Do you know anyone seeking office who describes his or herself as a liberal Republican?
Not anymore.
That's a great point.
Good point, good point.
And I might add, if you want a good book, you can start with this one, 11 Principles of a Reagan Conservative, written by somebody, let me just see here.
I covered up my name with the Postie
Yeah.
out of humility.
Oh, yeah,
But
Paul
he's
Kengor.
outing me. Look at that. Yeah. All right.
Great.
Thanks for the plug.
Well, you've done some wonderful writing, Paul, and thank you very much. Now let's turn to the, shall we call it, the elephant in the room, and that is the question of Donald Trump's impact on the conservative movement broadly, and specifically the impact of Donald Trump's indictment on the presidential primary season coming up. And the simple question is, does his indictment help or hurt him in the primaries? And if he were to be successful, how does it play out in the general election? And let's begin again with John and go down the line.
Clearly, Donald Trump represents a significant part of people participating in the Republican nomination process today. It's inarguable. Republican National Chairman Ronna McDaniel said if Donald Trump weren't part of the party, there'd be no party. There wouldn't be a blue-collar faction within the party. In addition, in 2007 at CPAC, describing the future of the Republican Party, I used the term populist, which means, of course, borrowing certain issues that in the past were not always considered conservative. And I cited as an example the presidential primary campaigns over the years of Pat Buchanan. Now, someone took exception to me using that word that day. Needless to say, it very frequently describes Trumpism within the Republican Party. Republicans, notably George W. Bush, used to talk about taking Social Security and eventually making it voluntary down the line, while maintaining it for current recipients. Donald Trump says no to that. He wants to preserve Social Security. Ditto for Medicare. And this comes at a time when very soon a recent report of the Medicare Board of Trustees noted the system will be insolvent. I might add 40% of doctors today do not accept Medicare. So again, one has to say that the approach of preserving the status quo is a populist position, but it's common in the Republican Party. So has Donald Trump had an impact? Yes. And I think the term I used earlier, Trump without the tweets, is what people look for. They don't criticize his philosophy, only his style and way of saying things. And so again, he's made a very definite impact that will last in the party for a long time. I would say probably as significant as Barry Goldwater made in the 1960s in terms of changing the Republican Party.
Okay. Jeff?
Yeah, I really do think that this indictment business is causing and will cause an enormous backlash. I mean, just listening to some of the media accounts yesterday, wow, I mean, across the board, I mean, you can start with the presidential candidates. It didn't matter whether it was Governor DeSantis or Nikki Haley or Vivek or any of these folks. They were livid.
Tim Scott.
And Tim Scott. And I think the base, if you will, is livid because they see this as using the deep state, if you will, to go after their political opponents. And this has been going on since the arrival of Donald Trump on the scene with the use of the FBI, of all things, and the Department of Justice to spy on his campaign, to go after him, et cetera. Now we've got this district attorney in New York City. I mean, this is just totally, totally unacceptable stuff. And the obvious point here that I think we're all aware of, if they can do this to Donald Trump, what about the rest of us here in this room?
Well, in the indictment so far has definitely helped Trump, I think, in what would be the primaries. I mean, in the last couple of weeks since the talk of the indictment, he's pulled ahead of DeSantis in polls by 20 points at least, I think, probably on average. That said, and I don't know if the Democrats are this Machiavellian and shrewd. Maybe they are. I think a lot of it's just emotional. They're looking for any way to get Trump in handcuffs that they can. But I think they want to run against him, frankly, because I think they believe that he's somebody that they can beat again. And I think they probably don't feel that way about some of the other Republicans. But Trump now in 2016 and 2020 got, what, 46% of the vote? And you need somebody who can get over 50% of the vote. And I think the Democrats are convinced that he can't get over 50. And I did a piece on this. Jeff and I both write for the American Spectator, so there's a plug for the American Spectator. I did a piece on nominating a Republican who can get 50% of the vote. I want you to think about some of these numbers. Between 1920 and 2020, 26 presidential elections. In 19 out of 26, the winner got over 50% of the vote. Now, in another 3, they got 49%, like 49.55, 49.72. So the norm is actually to get 50 or a little over 50. Both the Bushes got over 50% of the vote. Reagan got well over 50. In fact, 2022 is the 50th anniversary of the Nixon landslide election in '72. Anyone know what percentage of the vote Nixon got in 1972? 62%. He won 49 out of 50 states. And then Reagan in '80 won 44 out of 50 states, won the Electoral College 489 to 49 against an incumbent. And then in '84, Reagan won 49 out of 50 states, got almost 60% of the vote. This is an amazing number. Won the Electoral College 525 to 13. So Reagan twice won California, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts twice. What's the only state he didn't win?
Minnesota.
He didn't win it ever in '80 or in '84. So the Democrats have only won over 50%. I mean, Obama was the first to do it since Goldwater. I think Carter barely got over. It was like 50.1 0.08 or something like that. But it's the norm to get over 50, and I think, unfortunately, right, Trump is so utterly loathed and detested by over 50% of the population that I don't think he can get 50% and win. And I think the Democrats know that. And I'm wondering if part of this push right now for an indictment is to get Trump up among the base and in the primary so he can get the nomination. But that would probably be imparting too much shrewdness to people who just lash out and attack. But it could have that effect.
You know, one of the things about Donald Trump, I had the chance to interview him when he was a private citizen. I was for the Spectator back in 2014. And one of the things I said to him at the time is, you know, Donald, the Republican sort of base, if you will, gets infuriated with their nominees because they don't fight. And I said, you know, there is nice old likable Mitt Romney, and all of a sudden he gets nominated and he's being cast as this cold and cruel banker who wanted to take health care away from the cancer-stricken wife of an employee, and on and on. And, you know, he put his dog on the roof and they just go after him.
They did a John McCain.
And
too.
then John McCain, you know, they loved the Maverick, and then he gets nominated for president, and they're running front page stories in the New York Times that he's secretly having an affair with a lobbyist and all of this kind of thing. They went after him, and I said, the feeling is that these guys don't fight back. And he said, and I have this somewhere on tape, he said, oh, don't worry, I'll fight back.
You need that.
Which he most assuredly did. And I think that's one of the reasons why he won in the first place. He is not at all reluctant. And I understand people, you know, they sort of wince at the tweets and all of that kind of thing. But, you know, the realization is that the American media, the mainstream media, is against us. And they will use every tool in the toolbox to go out there and knock whomever. And I assure you, if Donald Trump vanished from planet Earth today and somebody else were the Republican nominee in 2024, that person would be the devil incarnate by the time the campaign was over.
Very, very astute observation. So our last question with 1 minute and 45 seconds left, so I'll ask you to be as concise as possible. We're going to be hearing soon from someone who's likely to be a Republican candidate for the nomination. What advice would you give to any candidate for the nomination, and how specifically do you think these candidates that are known, or the likelies that are known, have responded? Have they responded to the question of the impact of Trump's indictment well or poorly? And just for the heck of it, let's also address the question of, in unscripted responses, is their response to the question of Trump's indictment a reliable guide to their intelligence?
Yes, yes, and yes. The fact is that when one is under fire, who is popular beyond words among the grassroots, it's only natural to side with that person through the entire ordeal he's about to go through, if he's about to go through it. That's just the norm of it. And I think you will see bigger crowds for Donald Trump, more raucous rallies that he has, and a demonstration of the muscle he flexes in the Republican Party. To my knowledge, everyone else who's a possible contender has condemned the indictment, and that's going to be the norm. Look, I can remember when Governor Perry in 2016 denounced Donald Trump. No one paid attention. At one point, he said, "Have you no sense of decency, sir?" Nobody responded. And again, you see a big difference with attitudes toward the 45th president in his own party. I think it's a wise policy, whatever happens to Trump.
Yeah, I just think all of these other potential nominees realize that this goes well beyond Donald Trump, that this is an issue about the American people. And as I said, if Donald Trump today, any of us in our communities after that, and we're just not going to allow that. And I think all of these candidates are aware of that.
I'll give you 3 phrases. Be not afraid, be a fighter, but be smarter. And I
Well
think,
said.
yeah, that's what someone like a DeSantis needs to take from someone like a
Our
Trump.
time is up. We could sit here for 3 more hours and get more insights from these. But let's thank these 3 gentlemen for their contribution.